The first thing she learned to sew was a seam that didn't show. Her grandmother had taught her at the kitchen table, beneath a window that caught the thin London light and turned it to dust on the air. "Hide your stitches," the old woman had said, guiding small fingers, "and no one will know where things were mended." The lesson stuck so well it became a habit. Later, when she learned to hide her temper, her hunger, her tremors of hope, she did it with the same care she used on silk, small, even, invisible from the outside. By the time she turned 23, Ariel Hargrave had become very good at invisible things. She could cross a room as a shadow crosses a wall, present, necessary, easily ignored. At breakfast, she poured tea with a steady hand and counted the sugar cubes for her mother, 2 for sweetness, 1 for show. She answered when spoken to. She dressed in soft colours that did not announce themselves. She kept to the edges of drawing rooms and left the laughter to others more suited to it. London had 100 ways to decide who mattered. Names, fortunes, the cut of a bodice, the rumour of a dowry, the angle of a bow, none of which favoured a woman who had inherited neither money nor spectacle. Her sister possessed both. Isabella moved through the same rooms as if the world were a stage meant for her spotlight alone. She had their mother's yellow hair and perfect chin, and a knack for saying exactly what people needed to hear to feel clever when they answered. She liked to touch the sleeve of a man's coat as she laughed, and to turn her head just so when she listened, so a curl could tickle the pearl at her ear. The city had terms for such skills: charm, grace, beauty, and London spent them freely on Isabella. When men came to call, they brought flowers in boxes, not bunches, and they lingered by the window to be seen lingering. When women spoke of Isabella, they used words like radiant and lively and dear, while Ariel was given the soft adjectives kept for upholstery and wallpaper: pleasant, gentle, good. None of this surprised Ariel. It exhausted her sometimes, but did not surprise. She had watched it begin the year their father died, and the numbers beneath their roof began to shrink. He left them his name, the townhouse, the country place already mortgaged to its chimneys, and a portfolio of debts that behaved like strays. They followed you home, they multiplied, they learned to beg. Their mother, Lady Margaret, understood immediately that what was gone would not be returning. She wore black for a year, and then grey forever after, and she sharpened her daughters into needles, one meant to stitch a name to a fortune, the other to hem the edges of a situation that could not be altered but might be kept from fraying. "This house survives," Lady Margaret would say over ledgers at the escritoire, "on silk and silence. We cannot afford fuss." She never raised her voice. She did not need to. She had a way of lifting a single eyebrow that worked like a hook, catching any stray protest and reeling it in. Ariel did not rebel. It would have been like arguing with the weather. She learned to make herself useful in small, reliable ways. The cook liked her because she washed apples and never ate them. The housemaid liked her because she remembered birthdays and repaired cuffs. The footman liked her because she wrote the calling cards in a hand so clean the recipients sometimes kept them. The poor in Spitalfields liked her because she came when she said she would and stayed until the stove was lit, the soup ladled, the youngest child soothed. The mistress of the sewing-house called her "our dignity" when she thought Ariel couldn't hear, and Ariel pretended she hadn't heard because the words made her throat feel odd. She went to Spitalfields once a week, more when the weather turned mean. She wore a wool cloak and a bonnet she had retrimmed twice, and she tucked a packet of needles and a roll of calico into her basket alongside bread and a small bottle of violet water for the girl with the cracked lips. The streets were a geography of hard facts. Wet stone, cold wind, men with faces as pinched as fists, women whose hands never stopped moving. None of it frightened her. She had grown up in drawing rooms where smiles cut deeper. If anything did frighten her, it was the thought that one day she might stop feeling anything about any of it, that she might become one of those people who floated above the city like a paper lantern, all glow and no heat. On the morning the invitation arrived, she was mending the cuff of a housemaid's sleeve in the small sitting room her grandmother had favoured. The room still smelled of old tea and dried roses, a pleasant ghost. Snow had not yet come, but the sky was the right colour for it, and the coal fire had that particular sigh it gave when it felt unappreciated. Isabella swept in with the day's post as if the letters were a bouquet she had cultivated. "For me," she announced, and then, as if granting grace, "and for you." Ariel set down her needle. "Me?" Isabella plucked a heavy card from the stack and let it dangle from her fingers. "Lady Cavendish's winter ball. Of course you're invited." She smiled with the practiced benevolence of a saint depicted in glass. "We arrive late, we stand near the orchestra, and we make everything better by existing." "Everything," Ariel said, "except the accounts." Isabella's smile kept its shape, but lost its ease. "Don't be dreary. Mamma says dreary is vulgar in daylight." "Yes," Ariel said softly, "and poverty is vulgar in any light at all." Isabella's gaze softened a fraction. That could happen. Pity passed through her like a candle through a room. It brightened the place without changing the temperature. "You could at least be excited," she said, flipping the card over. "Lady Cavendish's chandeliers are taller than the Duke of W, and rumour says Ashbourne might appear." "Ashbourne," Ariel repeated, as if tasting the word might reveal a flavour. She had heard the name. Everyone had. A Marquess, widowed, who had retreated from the avid gaze the city turned on wealth and misfortune. There were stories. There were always stories, and people moved them around like coins, passing them hand to hand until they gleamed and bore little resemblance to how they began. Some said he had a temper. Some said he had a heart carved in stone. Most agreed he kept his estate balanced with the same cold precision he brought to his mourning. Ariel had no interest in either his temper or his precision. Men like that existed at elevations where women like her were cautioned against thin air. "Do not scowl," Isabella said lightly. "You'll make lines, and then no one will listen when you speak." "No one listens now," Ariel said. She smiled to make the words less sharp. "Except you, and you only when there are mirrors." Isabella laughed, a small chime. "I do love you when you're wicked. Promise me you will wear the blue silk, not the grey. The grey is warm. The blue is forgiven." They made a treaty. Ariel would wear the blue silk if Isabella would stay long enough at the sewing house on Thursday to teach 3 girls how to finish a hem without pricking their fingers bloody. Isabella pretended to consider and then agreed, because she liked the girls in the abstract and because she could not resist the shape Ariel's face made when hope crept into it. "Besides," Isabella said, settling her skirts, "it gives me material for conversation. Men love a charitable heart in theory." "A charitable heart in theory," Ariel murmured, but she said it fondly because Isabella's theories sometimes left coins in real hands. When their mother came in, the sisters rose as if a gust had lifted them. Lady Margaret was always the weather in a room. She brought with her a sense of temperature. Today her cheeks held the colour of a brisk walk, and her grey dress was buttoned so precisely that to look at it was to feel a seam straightening. She surveyed her daughters with the practiced appraisal of someone who had spent years dispatching assets to do battle against deficits. She kissed Isabella on the forehead, Ariel on the hair, and then held the invitation to the firelight to read. "We will go," she said, and her voice made it sound as if they might have chosen otherwise. "Ariel, we shall let out the blue silk at the waist and take the shoulders in. The dress is too honest about your shape." "Honest?" Ariel said. Lady Margaret's eyebrow moved the smallest degree. "You are strong. Do not invite them to think of the wrong kind of strength." "I'll reduce my arms," Ariel murmured, and Isabella squealed and swatted her with a folded handkerchief. "Do not reduce anything," Lady Margaret said. "Just be still. Men like to fill the space around stillness. It makes them feel as if they have shape." Ariel wanted to argue with the geometry of that, but she did not. She thought, instead of the girls in Spitalfields, of the way they stood when they weren't being watched. One hip cocked to rest the weight of a bucket, a knee bent to warm a joint that ached before it should, chins up, because some women, even early, understand that to drop a chin is to concede the floor. If men liked stillness, let them. She would be still if stillness made her invisible. She would move when movement mattered. The day of the ball arrived greased with anticipation. Coals burned hotter, not because they had more will, but because a household did. Servants moved with that special briskness that comes when something costly is at stake, and everyone knows they will be blamed if it slips. Ariel spent the afternoon in the small room where she kept a box of ribbon ends and odd lengths of lace too fine to throw away. She laid the blue silk on the bed and studied it as one might study a thought before speaking it. It had been her grandmother's dress once, heavily altered. At the bodice had been unpicked and re-sewn twice. The sleeves had been reshaped to follow fashion without courting ridicule. The skirt fell in a clean line, not lush, not mean. It was the colour of evening sky just before a snow, the exact shade that made some men think of things they could not name. She let out the waist a fraction and took in the shoulders, as her mother had said. She reseated the small cameo at the throat, the one her grandmother had given her, carved with the profile of a woman no one could identify. She wrapped a narrow ribbon of grey velvet around her wrist and tied it so the bow sat on the inside, a private luxury. When Mary, the housemaid, came to pin up her hair, Ariel asked her to leave a strand soft by the temple. "It's rebellious," Mary said, delighted. "You'll get us all scolded." "Let me keep one small rebellion," Ariel said. "We will tuck it back when we pass the landing." She found her mother in the drawing-room with the ledger open and a glass of cordial she would not finish. Lady Margaret looked up, and even she, who had trained herself against surprise and sentiment, hesitated. "You look like yourself," she said at last, and Ariel accepted it for what it was, the highest praise her mother knew how to give. In the carriage, Isabella chattered to keep the cold out. She named who would be there, which alliances were rumoured, which engagements were likely, which men were trying to disguise desperation as nonchalance. "You must stand where the light loves you," Isabella instructed, "but not where it loves you too much. Veils are better than candlesticks." "Veils," Ariel said, amused. "I thought we weren't allowed those until we failed at something irreversible." "We haven't failed," Isabella said brightly. "We're just not done." The ballroom was not the largest in London, but it had the best mirrors. They were set so cleverly one saw not merely oneself, but the version of oneself one wished to be. Taller, if you stood a pace back, more luminous if you stood beneath the right chandelier, more admired if you stood in the path of a gaze that could be returned at a flattering angle. Lady Cavendish had hired musicians who understood how to keep a crowd moving without exhausting it. Footmen drifted like chess pieces, unerringly in place just before a glass was empty. Ariel felt the familiar prickle at the base of her skull, the predictive geometry of rooms like this, the way clusters formed and split and reformed around a scent, a story, a face. They were announced, and people turned because people always turn. The first glances took in Isabella and did not entirely register Ariel. The second glances did. She could tell by the shift in expression, the way politeness rearranged itself to accommodate surprise. The blue silk had done its job. It asked to be considered. She did not seek anyone's gaze. She took her place by a pillar within polite distance of the orchestra, where a sensible woman could be invited to dance without being forced to refuse a man she did not wish to reward. Lord Everley arrived, ownership in his shoulders, and asked Isabella for the first quadrille with a flourish that said he had rehearsed it. Isabella tilted her head the necessary degree and did what was required, flattered him without trapping herself. Ariel exhaled quietly. That, too, was a kind of seam. A cluster of young men near the doorway laughed the way very young men do when they cannot feel their edges unless they scrape them against someone else. Ariel heard the word "poor thing" glide toward her like a draught and let it pass. It was an old draught. She was used to stuffing cotton in the cracks. She reached for the silver fan at her wrist and did not open it. She disliked hiding her mouth. She watched the dancers instead and counted, not steps, but distances, how far a person would go to stand near someone, how few inches could be made to feel like intimacy if one wished. Across the room, Lady Margaret held court not as a queen does, but as a watchmaker does, keeping track of which springs were likely to tighten and which were about to snap. She met Ariel's eye briefly and gave the smallest nod. Steady. Not yet. Then, as if conscience pricked her, she lifted a hand and made a motion that meant, "Breathe." Ariel obeyed. She breathed. She reminded herself that nothing essential about her would change because a room approved or did not. She had learned to measure days by other metrics, the warmth of a stove lit with one match, the way a child's hands stopped shaking after soup, the heavy quiet of a house where a mother slept for an hour because someone else had taken the baby. A waltz began, and she watched the floor bloom. Isabella turned with Lord Everley, glowing, and if there was calculation in her glow, Ariel loved her for it. Calculation was not sin when it fed a family. "You have the look of a strategist," a voice said quietly, "or a saint overlooking a battlefield. I'm undecided which." Ariel turned. The man beside her had approached without fuss, which impressed her. It meant he knew how to be present without rearranging the furniture of a moment. He was older than most on the floor, 35 perhaps, with a sober mouth and eyes the colour of the kind of sky sailors study. His coat was austerely cut. His gloves were immaculate and not concerned with being noticed. His hair was dark and only just beginning to show a thread of silver. She realized, with a small jolt she refused to display, that she recognized him from papers and whispers more than from life. "My look," she said, is usually interpreted as boredom. He smiled slightly. Then the interpreters are bad at their work. She waited for the introduction that would place him, for the little bow that would deliver his name into the air like an assignment, but he did not give it, which was almost a kind of courtesy. He was offering her the chance to ignore who he was and merely respond to what he had said. "I am good at seeming still," she said. "It is not the same as being bored." "Stillness," he said, "is underrated." "By men," she replied. "By the wrong men," he corrected. The waltz ended. She could feel the room recalibrating around them with the soft, meticulous attention society pays when something interesting might happen. The man did not draw closer. He did not ask for a dance. He merely looked at her as if he were memorizing the arrangement of pieces on a board before making a move he could not untake. A woman in emerald passed behind him and snatched his attention, not because she was more beautiful, but because she was speaking his name loudly to someone in order to be overheard. Marquess, Ariel heard, threaded through with the rustle of fans. She did not curtsy. She did not flutter. She did not pretend not to have heard. She inclined her head with the same respect she would have given anyone who had spoken to her with respect. If he was offended by her equal measure, he did not show it. If he was pleased, he did not either. He vanished as quietly as he had arrived, absorbed by a knot of eager conversation near the staircase, and left behind only a faint impression of winter, clean, bracing, the kind that makes a person stand straighter. When she found her mother again, Lady Margaret had the look she wore when a calculation had become unexpectedly favourable. "Do not," she said without preface, "step backward." "I was thinking of stepping outside," Ariel said. "There is too much perfume to smell the music." "Then go," her mother said. 7 minutes. No more. If anyone asks for you, I will say you have a headache that makes you lovelier." Ariel laughed softly and slipped through a door onto the terrace. The air felt honest. The night had not decided to snow, but it had decided to remind everyone that it might. The garden was a geometry of hedges and lamps and tidy gravel paths, and somewhere nearby a fountain made the sound of coins being counted, which made her think of the same sound in her head when she tried to sleep. She set her hands on the cold stone of the balustrade and looked up. The sky had that pale depth it sometimes wore, as if what lay beyond it were not darkness, but a paler kind of light. Quiet footsteps approached. She did not turn. It was a good test. Whether a person assumed their arrival must be acknowledged. The footsteps stopped at a respectful distance. "Do you prefer air to applause?" the voice asked. His voice again, calm and low, without the damp sheen of flattery. "I prefer what does not have to be purchased," she said. "Air is not free in London," he said dryly. "One way or another, we all pay." She turned then. "Do you keep a ledger of metaphors as well as rents, my lord?" His mouth almost smiled. "Sometimes I do." A breath. "Blackwood." "I know," she said, and then, because it was kinder, "Ariel Hargrave." He repeated her name as if he were trying it on to see if it fitted. She felt the ridiculous, involuntary flutter that happens when a person says your name as if it matters in their mouth. He glanced toward the lit doorway and then back to her. "Your sister dances well," he said. "She has the advantage of everyone wanting her to," Ariel said. "Dancing is easier when an entire room is consenting." "And you?" "I move better when no one is watching." "I do most things better when no one is watching," he said. "Unfortunately, no one is rarely in attendance." She looked at him properly then. Grief is not a uniform, but it leaves marks on cloth. She could see them. She could see, too, the discipline wealth demands of the principled, and the peculiar weariness that comes when a man has had to be relied upon, even in rooms where he was not loved. "Why do you come?" she asked, "if you dislike being seen?" "Duty," he said. "Custom. Sometimes because it is good for a boy to stand in a room and listen to the way wealth talks and hear how ugly it can make a sentence." "A boy?" "My steward's son. He will inherit numbers some day, if not lands. He should know the tone of rooms he may have to enter." "And tonight?" she asked. "Did he come?" "No," he said. "Tonight I came alone." She almost asked why. The question pressed against her teeth, warm and unnecessary. She did not ask it. She nodded instead toward the doorway. "We should go back in," she said. "People will imagine tragedies." "They always do," he said. "It saves them from confronting the small cruelties they actually perform." Ariel swallowed a smile she did not wish to show him yet. "You should write for the papers," she said. "They like clever men." "I am too expensive for gossip," he said, and this time the smile did reach his mouth. A flicker only, like a door opened a finger's width onto a room that contained something not cold. They re-entered the ballroom as if the air had been asked to welcome them more warmly. Eyes flicked, interest wove and unwove itself. Ariel drifted toward her pillar again, the place where the music's edge softened thoughts. The waltz began, and within 2 measures the Marquess of Ashbourne crossed the floor with a stride that announced nothing and a demeanor that announced everything. Consideration, decision, consequence. People watched. Of course they watched. Ariel's mouth went dry, and she had no idea if the sensation was dread or relief at the way a story sometimes chooses you. "Miss Hargrave," he said when he reached her. He bowed the exact degree the situation required, no more, which would have been theatre, no less, which would have been cruelty. "My lord," she answered, and, because she had spent a lifetime hiding stitches, she stood very still and let the room try to guess what she was thinking. He did not immediately ask her to dance. He offered his hand, and, for one long suspended second that stretched like silk pulled taut, waited as if he were not merely asking for a turn around the floor, but placing a piece on a board in a game that would decide whether she existed only where others placed her or where she chose to stand. Somewhere behind them, Isabella laughed at something Lord Everley said that wasn't funny, and their mother's heart thumped once, hard, against the cage of her stays, and London leaned forward as if the city itself had a posture. Ariel looked at his hand. She thought of hidden seams. She thought of the girls who pricked their fingers for want of a thimble and licked the blood away because what else could one do? She thought of how quickly a rumour could become a garment everyone had to wear. She thought of her grandmother's lesson: hide your stitches so no one will know where things were mended. Then she reached out very calmly and placed her hand in his, not as a woman being saved, but as a woman choosing how to move. The morning after the ball unfolded like a page written in ink too dark to ignore. Ariel woke not to the soft quiet of her chamber, but to the weight of memory, his hand extended, his bow deliberate, the breathless silence of 100 witnesses as the Marquess of Ashbourne knelt before the sister no one had ever chosen. For years she had trained herself to forget each small slight before it could bruise, but this memory refused to fade. It pulsed with a strange light, not triumph, not disbelief, but something raw, as if a door had opened in a house she thought she knew by heart. The Hargrave townhouse itself seemed unsettled by the gesture. Servants moved with nervous urgency, whispers rippling from pantry to stairwell. Lady Margaret's boots clicked like punctuation across marble, her mind already calculating the advantages. Isabella sulked in brocade near the window, her fan snapping shut like a reprimand every time someone mentioned the Marquess's name. Ariel, caught in the eye of the storm, longed for silence, but found none. She sat at her dressing table, staring at the cameo brooch at her throat, and wondered how a single moment could tilt the balance of an entire city's gossip. When the card arrived, ivory, embossed, carrying his seal, her breath caught, though she pretended calm. The Marquis of Ashbourne requested the honour of calling that afternoon. Her mother nearly spilled her tea. Isabella bit the inside of her cheek until a rose of anger bloomed beneath her powdered skin. Ariel merely folded the napkin on her lap and murmured, "Perhaps this is not a spectacle." To which her mother replied, "Everything in Mayfair is a spectacle, dear." At 3 o'clock, Lucian Blackwood entered their parlour with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to scrutiny, but untouched by it. He greeted Lady Margaret, bowed to Ariel, and spoke with deliberate courtesy, as if each word were chosen with the precision of a man who knew the world, recorded everything he did. When he asked Ariel for a private word, the air tightened with a mix of scandal and anticipation. Behind a half-open door, he confessed, "I owe you an explanation. I made you a target last night. Whether I intended to or not, my action has drawn attention to you, and not all of it kind." Ariel met his gaze, steady, and asked why. He answered simply, "Because you stood your ground. You did not run." It was not romance he offered, not yet. Instead, he proposed a public courtship, a shield against slander, a strategy against gossip. His words were practical, even cold, yet beneath them lay something unspoken, recognition, respect, a curiosity he did not grant lightly. Ariel surprised herself with her reply, "I will consider it, but I will not be pitied." His quiet answer, "You have my word," stirred more than all the flattery she had ever heard in London's glittering rooms. That evening, she found herself at her window long after midnight, watching fog roll over the gaslit square. When a carriage stopped below, her heart stumbled in her chest. By morning, a letter awaited her, discreetly slipped under the door of the Spitalfields sewing house. A month's rent had been paid in full, unsigned, but carrying the faint scent of bergamot. Ariel folded it with trembling hands. No acknowledgment required, no credit taken, merely a shared concern. Thus began the strangest of seasons. Society buzzed like a hive. Some claimed the Marquis sought to atone for grief. Others insisted Ariel schemed her way into his notice. Invitations doubled, eyes sharpened, whispers lengthened. But beyond the salons and scandals, Ariel walked through soot-streaked alleys into the sewing house, knelt beside shivering girls, and stitched sleeves with hands steadier than her breath. Lucian, too, began to appear at odd hours, glimpsed in the threshold of doorways, watching without intruding, listening without judgment. In time, she learned he carried his own locked doors, the music room where his late wife's piano sat untouched, the silence he wore like armour, the uncle who whispered that sentiment was weakness. Yet when he saw Ariel's sketches for a seamstress school, when he realized she dreamed not of jewels, but of looms and lessons for girls who had nothing, something shifted. For a moment, his gaze lost its winter. "You surprise me," he said softly. And Ariel, heart trembling, answered, "Do I?" The days stretched and folded into weeks. and with them came trials more piercing than admiration. Anonymous notes slipped into her reticule, forged ledgers twisted into lies, poison whispered in parlours and printed in scandal sheets. Isabella, too, began to unravel under the strain of envy and guilt. London loved its gossip more than its truth, and Ariel, once invisible, became both symbol and target. Yet even as doubt seeped into Lucian's house like damp, she learned something vital. Dignity was not silence. It was choosing when to speak, and when she did, her voice carried more weight than the chandeliers above Mayfair's ballrooms. And so the season of spectacle became the season of reckoning, where a forgotten sister found herself thrust into light, not for beauty or fortune, but for the courage to meet the world without bowing. The weeks that followed were a strange blend of fire and frost. Ariel had once believed that life moved in steady increments, days folding neatly into each other, measured by the strike of the church bell or the fading of lamplight on the square. But after the Marquis knelt before her, time broke its rhythm. Some days rushed forward in a blur of speculation, every whisper in London chasing her shadow. Other days dragged like heavy fabric across stone, weighed down by doubt, rumour, and the slow ache of waiting for a knock at the door that might never come. Her mother arranged the parlour each morning as if staging a play. Fresh flowers, polished silver, the chairs angled toward the window so that visitors might see their reflections softened in sunlight. Lady Margaret's voice carried the practiced brightness of a general preparing soldiers for parade. "Remember, Ariel, silence is not passivity, it is calculation. Let them see what you choose, and no more." Ariel obeyed outwardly, but in the quiet of her room she pressed charcoal to paper, sketching plans for a school where silence would mean concentration, not erasure. Lucian came often enough to stir society into frenzy, but not often enough to satisfy the hunger of her thoughts. His visits were formal, always with his uncle lurking like a hawk in the corner, his presence a reminder that every kindness was observed, every word weighed. Yet between the etiquette and the orchestrated civility, there were moments, flickers, that carried more intimacy than hours of conversation. The brush of his glove when he steadied her hand over a teacup, the way his gaze lingered a second longer than necessary when she spoke of Spitalfields. Once he found her alone in the corridor, her sketchbook half hidden beneath her arm. "You draw," he said. She answered with quiet defiance. "I build." His eyes softened, though his words remained measured. "Perhaps we are not so different." But the world beyond their silences grew sharper. Isabella, radiant as ever, began to wilt beneath comparison. For years she had been the diamond of their household, the one men circled and women envied. Now, with each newspaper column dubbing Ariel London's new rose, her laughter rang brittle, her fan snapped with restless urgency. In stolen moments, her sister's jealousy leaked out like poison through cracks in porcelain. "He doesn't want you," Isabella hissed one night, her face a mask of rouge and bitterness. "He wants to prove he still commands attention. You are nothing but his defiance dressed in silk." Ariel answered softly, "Perhaps the world never looked closely enough to see me before." But the words burned long after they left her lips. Scandals bloomed like nightshade. A note appeared beneath her reticule at a musicale. "He's lost before. He'll lose again. Ask him about the roses." The handwriting was disguised, but the paper bore Ashbourne's watermark. Ariel read it without flinching, though her fingers trembled. Later that evening, She smiled at Lucian as though nothing had changed, but her heart paced like a trapped bird. When the rumour reached the papers, painting her as a schemer who snared a grieving Marquess, Lady Margaret pressed her daughter's hands and whispered fiercely, "You must accept his proposal before the ink dries. Pride cannot survive scandal." Ariel shook her head. "Nor can love survive fear." Still, the pressure mounted. London's winter garden parties became arenas where she stood trial beneath gaslight and snow. At one such gathering, Lucian sought her out among the frost-touched hedges, a small box heavy in his pocket. She saw it, felt the moment crest like a wave about to break, and then, before he could kneel, pamphlets rustled through the crowd. Silas Fairfax, the venomous columnist, had printed a piece titled "The Hargrave Arrangement." It accused Ariel of orchestrating her rise, painted her family as opportunists, reduced her dreams to currency. Gasps fluttered like startled birds. Lucian's hand hesitated. His eyes searched hers, full of conflict. He closed the box and tucked it away. "If you believe any of it," Ariel said, voice steady though her throat ached, "then go." "I don't," he answered, but his certainty faltered, and that falter wounded her more than accusation ever could. That night she sat alone, ink-stained gloves clutched in her lap, surrounded by letters from patrons withdrawing their support for the Spitalfield school. Her sketchbook was returned to her with its pages mutilated, forged calculations twisting her designs into evidence of greed. She did not cry. She did not scream. Instead, she traced each false number with her fingertip and whispered, "Nothing is harmless. Not in this city." Then she stood, resolve stiffening like steel beneath velvet. If society wished to bury her, she would not be buried quietly. She sought allies where truth still mattered. A young reporter, Thomas Reed, placed ledgers in her hands, proof that Lord Henry Blackwood, Lucian's uncle, had paid Fairfax to ruin her. An archivist uncovered a suppressed note from the coroner's inquest into Lucian's late wife, hinting at financial isolation and silenced distress. The threads wove into a tapestry of manipulation so intricate that only exposure could cut it free. Ariel sealed the evidence in a packet and sent it to Ashbourne House, without a letter, without plea, only the silent weight of truth. Days later, at the grand charity gala, she stepped onto marble floors draped not in glittering jewels, but in dove-grey satin, embroidered only with a thistle, delicate, overlooked, impossible to crush. Gasps followed her like shadows. She mounted the dais and lifted her voice not as a supplicant, but as a witness. She named Fairfax. She named Henry Blackwood. She placed the ledger and the inquest before the crowd. Gasps turned to uproar, scandal into revelation. Fairfax was dragged away, his ink-stained fingers trembling. And in that charged silence, Lucian descended the staircase. He bowed his head before her, not in gallantry, but in repentance. "I did not trust you," he said, voice breaking, "and in doing so, I betrayed what you are." Then he knelt, not to rescue, but to ask for the chance to earn her love freely. The ballroom trembled with awe. Ariel's eyes filled, though no tears fell. For the first time, she was not invisible. She was seen. The battle was not over. Lord Henry spat his fury, brandishing debts like chains. Ariel stood her ground, presenting her own book of plans, schemes for tenant education, for sustainable estates, for futures beyond fear. Lucian placed his hand over hers and declared, "This is the vision I choose." Trustees rose. Votes were cast. The iron grip of Henry Blackwood fractured at last. That night, snow fell upon London like absolution. Ariel returned to her room, removed her veil, and gazed into the mirror once owned by the late Marchioness. For years she had seen only awkwardness, shadow, silence. Now she saw a woman who had spoken when it mattered most, who had refused to bow, who had built her own place in the light. She touched the thistle embroidered on her gown and whispered, "Uncrushed." And far across the city, in the chambers of Ashbourne House, Lucian Blackwood stood before the once locked music room, key trembling in his hand. For 6 years it had been sealed by grief. Tonight he turned the lock, pushed the door, and let light spill into silence. The first sound that entered was not music, but memory, the echo of a woman's voice who refused to be unseen. Snow lingered on the eaves of Ashbourne House long after the rest of London had melted into mud. It clung stubbornly to stone, as if unwilling to release the weight of silence that had ruled there for years. But inside, the air no longer felt entirely frozen. Servants whispered of change. Doors once closed without question were now unlocked, if only for a breath of light. Yet with every step forward, shadows resisted, and the fight for truth was not finished. Ariel discovered this quickly. The morning after the gala, she returned to Spitalfields, expecting to find celebration among the seamstresses. Instead, she found worry. Letters from patrons who had promised renewed funding now trembled with hesitation. Some feared aligning themselves against men of Henry Blackwood's stature. Others fretted that scandal still clung to Ariel like soot. Mrs. Penbury wrung her ink-stained hands and muttered, "Good deeds are fragile things, Miss Hargrave. They break if leaned on too hard." Ariel set her jaw. "Then we shall not lean. We shall build." She stitched alongside the girls that day, mending sleeves and teaching neat hems, her fingers raw but resolute. In her sketchbook she began drafting not only patterns for uniforms but plans for partnerships, tradesmen who might donate scraps, widows who might take in apprentices, tenants who could contribute what little they had. Hope was delicate, but it was work, not wish. Meanwhile, Lucian wrestled with a truth more bitter than scandal. In his study, he confronted his uncle with the evidence. Fairfax's confessions, the forged accounts, the payments traced directly to Henry's hand. Henry did not flinch. "I did not destroy her," he said coldly. "I revealed her. She is poor, she is unfit, and you, blinded by grief, are about to ruin centuries of Ashbourne's strength." Lucian's voice was quiet, but steel ran beneath it. "You used my late wife's paper, her ink, her memory. You have dishonored us both." Henry sneered. "She would have agreed with me. Nobility requires sacrifice." Lucian turned away before his rage could consume him. For the first time in years, he felt no loyalty to the man who had raised him like a ward, but treated him like a ledger. He walked the corridors of Ashbourne that night in silence, his footsteps echoing through marble halls heavy with portraits of ancestors who seemed to stare with judgment. When he passed the newly opened music room, the soft gleam of Ariel's sketches pinned to the walls caught his eye. In their lines, of classrooms, of dormitories, of sunlight over workbenches, he saw the shape of a different inheritance, not one built on fear, but on possibility, But London would not let them breathe. Fairfax's downfall left a vacuum, and gossip rushed to fill it. Pamphlets circulated, claiming Ariel had bewitched the Marquess, that her charitable dreams were veils for ambition. Balls and musicales became battlefields of rumour. Even Isabella, once Ariel's fiercest rival, faltered under the weight of shame. Her alliance with Fairfax had not been direct, but whispers tied her name to his schemes, and suitors grew scarce. One evening she cornered Ariel in the corridor, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I never meant to ruin you," she whispered. "I only wanted not to vanish." Ariel looked at her sister, the powder cracking, the bravado gone, and answered gently, "We are not meant to outshine one another, only to be seen as we are." Isabella wept then, not with vanity, but with regret. The city's cruelty reached its sharpest edge when forged documents appeared in the press. Pages torn from Ariel's sketchbook, altered to look like financial calculations for Ashbourne's fortune. Circles in red ink marked her name beside the words "securable through marriage." The accusation stung deeper than all the whispers. It painted her not as visionary, but as parasite. Patrons withdrew again, this time more firmly. The seamstress school seemed lost. Ariel sat in her chamber that night, the falsified pages spread before her like wounds. Thomas Reed, the young reporter who had become her unlikely ally, arrived with new evidence. Bank drafts linking Fairfax's payments directly to Henry Blackwood. Together, they pieced the puzzle. Henry had orchestrated everything, silencing Lucian's late wife, weaponizing scandal, feeding the press with poison. "If this reaches daylight," Thomas murmured, "he cannot stand." Ariel closed the ledger and whispered, "Then let us give it sunlight." The next gala became her stage. Not draped in jewels, not begging for pity, she walked into Lancaster House wearing dove-grey satin embroidered with a thistle at the hem. Gasps rippled as she mounted the dais. With calm precision, she laid the ledger before London's elite. She spoke not of romance, not of pity, but of truth, of funds stolen, of voices silenced, of futures buried beneath ink. Fairfax was dragged out in disgrace. Henry stood exposed. And in the hush that followed, Lucian descended the staircase, his voice carrying like steel wrapped in velvet. "I did not trust her, and in failing to trust, I betrayed what she always was." Then he knelt, not as rescuer, as penitent. "I ask not forgiveness tonight, but the chance to earn it with every choice that follows." Ariel's eyes filled, but she did not weep. She extended her hand. The room, once her enemy, trembled with awe. Yet even victory bore scars. Henry spat venom one last time, brandishing records of Hargrave debts. He declared Ariel a ruin in disguise, but Ariel met him head-on, unveiling her own book of plans, schemes for education, for sustainable estates, for futures built not on fear, but on resilience. Lucian placed his hand over hers, declaring, "This is the vision I choose. And if I must sell Ashbourne tapestry by thread to fund it, I will." Trustees rose. Votes were cast. Henry's reign collapsed beneath the weight of truth. When Ariel returned home that night, the snow was falling, soft as absolution. She removed her veil, looked into the mirror once owned by the Marchioness, and saw not the forgotten sister, not the scandal's victim, but a woman fully seen. Behind her reflection stood the faint outline of Lucian, steady, waiting, no longer armored in silence, but in choice. The path ahead would not be easy. London still whispered, patrons still wavered, but a seed had been planted, and Ariel knew seeds thrived in unlikely soil. She touched the thistle embroidered at her hem and whispered, "Uncrushed." And in Ashbourne House, Lucian opened the music room wide for the first time in 6 years, letting light and sketches and laughter spill into the silence. For once, grief loosened its grip. For once, he could imagine a future not haunted, but chosen. The bells of St. George's tolled low and solemn, their sound carrying across Hanover Square like a benediction. Morning light fell pale and unadorned through winter clouds, gilding the stone steps where London society gathered in expectant hush. This was not the usual spectacle of ribbons and gossip, though both lingered at the edges. It was something quieter, heavier, as if the city itself recognized that today was not merely a marriage, but a reckoning. Inside the church, rows of pews brimmed with faces that had once mocked, pitied, or ignored Ariel Hargrave. Now their eyes followed her every movement as she entered, her gown a pale celadon silk that whispered of river water and rebirth. She wore no diamonds, no tiara, only the lace veil her sister had smoothed with trembling hands. Behind her, Isabella walked in silence, not as a rival, but as a companion, her expression fragile, her smile real at last. Lady Margaret clutched a handkerchief, though no tears had yet fallen, her dignity balanced between past regrets and present pride. Lucian waited at the altar. He wore no theatrical smile, no armor of arrogance, only the steady gaze of a man who had endured loss and chosen to risk again. When Ariel reached his side, the world seemed to fold into stillness. The vicar spoke, Latin and English weaving solemn vows, but it was Lucian's voice that carried deepest. "I vow to walk beside you, not ahead, to shelter, but not smother, to listen when you are silent, and to hear when you speak. I vow partnership, not possession." Ariel's reply came soft but resolute, echoing like bells through vaulted arches. "I vow to believe in what we build, even when storms come, to name truth when it wounds, to see not the title, but the man, to love not for wealth or station, but for the soul behind them." Gaslight flickered. A child coughed. Somewhere a pen scratched furiously in a reporter's hand. Yet for those moments, the vows silenced London's ceaseless hunger. They exchanged rings without flourish, kissed without spectacle. No music swelled, only breath, only the quiet rustle of silk. And when they turned to face the crowd, it was not triumph that shone on Ariel's face, but calm recognition. She was no longer unseen. After the ceremony, Ashbourne House opened its music room at last. For years it had been sealed by grief. Today it bloomed with Ariel's sketches pinned across the walls, plans for classrooms, dormitories, reading nooks, all small revolutions in ink. Servants carried trays, children laughed in corners, and the estate breathed as though awake for the first time in years. Lady Margaret pulled Ariel aside, voice low. "I once married for duty. It gave me safety, but no joy. Today I envy you." Ariel pressed her mother's hand, 2 generations bound not by silence, but by survival. Isabella, too, had changed. She no longer wielded beauty like a blade. She had married quietly to a man who loved her without needing her to dazzle. Twins with mischievous green eyes tugged at her skirts. She laughed without vanity. In time, her remorse gave way to gentleness. "You never needed forgiving," she whispered to Ariel one evening as they folded lace together. "Only seeing." Ariel smiled. "And you finally saw me?" The seamstress school thrived. With new patrons, with Lucian's steady support, and with Ariel's unyielding vision, Spitalfields transformed. Girls once bent over threadbare sleeves now learned letters by firelight. Dormitories rang with laughter, not coughs. Needles stitched not desperation, but futures. On the wall hung a sampler sewn by a girl of 10, crooked but bold. Be brave and soft and true. Years passed. Ashbourne House filled with life. Children's footsteps echoed across marble halls, not in mischief, but in joy. Ariel carried her dark-haired daughter on her hip, Lucian guiding a son with steady hands sticky from honey. Isabella's boys raced through gardens. Lady Margaret read bedtime stories instead of ledgers. The estate, once silent as a mausoleum, now breathed with warmth. Yet, not all threads tied neatly. Henry Blackwood, stripped of power, vanished into obscurity. No letters came, no apology. His silence was not peace, only absence. Fairfax died forgotten in a Bristol boarding house, his ink-stained fingers stilled. Thomas Reed, older and bespectacled, continued his crusade in print, visiting Ashbourne often, carrying news of reforms sparked by Ariel's defiance. And Ariel? She grew older, her hair darkening, her hands more often smudged with ink than ringed with jewels. Yet her eyes, always keen, always steady, never dulled. She had learned to hold joy without fearing its loss. One evening, she stood on the east balcony, her child asleep against her shoulder, Lucian's hand warm in hers. "Do you ever wonder," he murmured, "how close we came to missing all of this?" Ariel turned to him, eyes soft with wonder. "Not any more." I only wonder how I ever lived before knowing what it meant to be chosen." In that moment, she saw her reflection in the tall mirror once owned by the Marchioness. Years ago, she had seen only awkwardness, invisibility, the echo of cruel nicknames. Now she saw a woman fully seen, a partner, a mother, a visionary who had refused to bow. She had built a life where none was offered. She had become not the shadow, not the scandal, but the center of her own story. The house filled with laughter, the school with light, the city with whispers of change. And if the world tried again and again to forget women like her, Ariel Hargrave Blackwood knew there was now a place, a school, a home, a love that would remember. Always. Because dignity was never silence. It was the courage to speak, the strength to endure, and the grace to love freely. And Ariel, once the unseen sister, would never again be forgotten.